Rebecca.
We just moved.
You can show us.
Want to see?
There are people working?
Yeah. So it's 6 o'clock at night. We are back at the office. Behind me, you see kind of our office. We have a bunch of models we didn't arrange yet. That are still kind of being sourced and arranged. Our model shop is being assembled. Behind me, ODA, say hi. We've got the team here working on a new tower in Times Square. Very exciting. We've got a team here. Say hi. Hey, hello. This team is working on about 1,000 apartments in Brooklyn on the waterfront. Here's Chris. Say hi.
Hi.
Chris is our technical director. And I'm going back to the conference room.
Okay. Para.
Okay.
Ok. Comenzamos, ¿no?
Sí.
Bueno, gracias a los que van entrando, pero mientras entran vamos a contarles un poco cómo va a ser y a presentarles a Eran Chen, que es el fundador y el director ejecutivo del estudio o de la oficina de arquitectura ODA en New York. Eran estudió en la Universidad Bezabel en Jerusalén y desarrolló su carrera en Estados Unidos, donde fundó en 2007 la oficina ODA, y desde ese momento ha tenido una producción muy prolífica y de alrededor de 1 millón de metros cuadrados, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en otros 12 países del mundo, entre los cuales pronto en Buenos Aires, con 2 proyectos que hemos desarrollado con él en su primera etapa de diseño. Eran es profesor en un posgrado de bienes raíces en Columbia University y forma parte del board de la universidad donde estudió. Y bueno, estamos aquí un poco para conocerlo, para escucharlo, para ver su arquitectura, que nos parece muy interesante. Y para eso organizamos esto, que es un poco una exposición y un poco una conversación, que les pedimos a ustedes que lo hagan vía chat, en todo caso las preguntas que quieran hacer. Y para los cuales invitamos a Flora Mantiola, que es la vicepresidenta de CEPAO, además de ser Flora Mantiola, a Ludmila Kripa, que además de ser Ludmila Kripa, es profesora en la Universidad de Buenos Aires en proyecto. Está María, Rodrigo y Alejandro del estudio, y también veo a Roberto Eisenson. Y Tachit, Leandro Israel, que también trabajó en los proyectos que citamos. Eran, I introduce you in a minute, so you can go. En la actualización de Zoom hay una transcripción que pueden habilitar, y van a salir los subtítulos en inglés de cuando Eran o alguien hable en inglés. Por lo menos ayuda a la comprensión. So, Aaron, you can begin.
Okay.
Where are you?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, great to be here. Thank you, Pablo, for the introduction. I did catch a word or two about what you said, but I can't say that I understood every word of it. I'm super happy to share this evening with you guys. Argentina and Argentinians have been very close to my heart the past few years. I've gained a lot of very good close friends. I visited Buenos Aires and other parts of Argentina with my family and alone. I explored the southern part of Argentina, the beauty landscape, the nice cities. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of chemistry, both personally and in terms of just the spirit that I found with a lot of you people. And there's nothing better than share some ideas about architecture with you. Maybe just as a way of introduction, and then I think we should start with some questions and have a dialogue. I didn't plan a lecture. I do want to basically follow your questions, give you some examples of projects that I work on, and you know, and maybe share the screen and show some of the things. But anytime anybody has a question or whatever, please, this is more of a dialogue than a lecture. Do you guys want to start with questions?
People here know ODA, but if you can explain us in 5 minutes the origin and the development of the office, it's okay.
Absolutely. So ODA is a fairly young company. I've opened the practice in 2007. On a personal note, I grew up in Israel. I went to school in Bezalel. I served at the army for 4 years, which is quite typical for Israelis. And then I came to New York as a young architect. And to be honest, it was a bit of an American story. I was an immigrant in a large city. I didn't know anybody. And I was looking for a job. And the first weeks, I was looking for job applications in the New York Times. It was very hard to find a job. It was 1999. It wasn't a bad recession, but it was not a great time for architects. I also didn't go to school here, so it's not like I, you know, was built in with an after-school program. And somehow I landed a job at a big firm that is called Perkins Eastman. There was about 750 architects back then. And I was just glad to be part of sort of the American dream, if you will. I started doing design competition for the large firm. They started locally and then stretched to internationally in many different fields, from schools to hospitals to mixed-use projects. And I guess the big bosses at my office have recognized that we started to win more competition that they're used to. And they asked me to build sort of a competition team, which I did. And after 2 or 3 years of winning competition and working on projects in different places of the world, I got tired of this. And I said, I want to work on real projects in New York City. And they said, fine, go ahead. And I started looking for clients myself within the firm. And that led me to residential projects in New York City. Now, before that, I have to say, the sector of building residential buildings were not necessarily my focus or things that I sort of admired and wanted to do. But I started falling in love with the idea of living in big cities. And perhaps because of my personal being and being an immigrant, perhaps because I was a young person in New York City, living in a studio apartment, looking at a wall. I was very intrigued by the idea of breaking the mold, breaking the sort of unbelievable restriction mold that exists in New York zoning code in building buildings, and trying to see if there are ways by which we can look at buildings slightly differently, where the focus was improving of people's life. I was focused on two very important and simple items. The exposure of apartments that typically were just one direction. I wanted to give more exposure and light and air. And the idea of outdoor spaces. How can more apartments enjoy not a typical balcony, but something that is really furnishable? And that led me to start studying the extent by which building can breathe within the zoning envelope. It's something that is typical in many cities, and something I've learned, that the zoning regulation, the limitation of buildings that limits us all as architects, are sort of an excuse to build sort of dumb boxes, extruded boxes. And I started challenging that, which led to a lot of very interesting but small residential buildings. And thereafter, in 2007, I decided to leave ODA, Perkins Eastman, and open ODA. There are very interesting stories. One of them was, I had no money, and I had a few clients that I created a relationship with through the time at Perkins Eastman. But I decided, I was adamant that I have to leave. And my wife, we had 2 kids at that time, walk-up apartment on the Upper West Side. She was supportive. And I went to one of my clients and I said, listen, I have good news and bad news. I said, the good news is I've decided to open my own practice. The bad news is I cannot continue to serve you as part of Perkins Eastman, because that's kind of the big firm before. And he said to me, he said, well, you know, I've got a project in Madison Square Park. It's a new project. We have to convert a 400,000 square foot building in Madison Square Park, and we have to add 2 floors to it. It's a very large project. And I got a few proposals from different architects. The average proposal was, I remember, $2.2 million back then. And he said, if you do it for $1 million, I'll give you the project. Typical developer, right? So I didn't think twice. And I said, well, his name was Tesler. I said, Mr. Tesler, that's interesting, I will do it. But to be honest, in order to do this, I need a team of at least 10 people. I need computers. I don't even have a bank account. I don't have any money. And he said, well, how much money do you need? And I said, I don't know. And by the way, I had no idea. So I said, I don't know, maybe $150,000. And he said, okay. He opened his big kind of drawer on the desk. He's a big developer, used to smoke a big cigar. And he opened the book and he said, who do I write the check to? And that's how it all started. And that's the honest truth. We rented a small apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a studio apartment, bought a few desks from IKEA and a few computers, and we started working. When I say we, there's 4 people who came with me from Perkins Eastman, and they wanted to kind of join that. And we started going. There's many stories about how we survived as a young practice. You can imagine that 2007 was the worst time ever to open a practice. It was just before the big recession. But we were nimble and flexible, and we've done some very interesting small work. And since 2010, the office started to get bigger and bigger commissions. We've done to date about 55 different buildings in New York City. And in the past few years, we're designing mostly nationally and internationally. And so the practice today, as you saw here, we have about 100 architects and interior designers, urban designers, and we work on very exciting projects that I hope I can share with you.
Excuse me, I was muted. Ludmila, ¿querés empezar? Do you want to begin with some questions, because yours are the more architectural introduction.
Okay, thank you, Yuran. I have a question about your kind of office you have, ODA, being such a global practice and developing projects in different cities. You are often interacting with different cultures and different environments. And I wanted to know if you think that architecture can be universal or if it has to adapt to its context. And if it does, what's the way you interact with that kind of social, cultural, technological, and even architectural context in your projects?
Thank you, Ludmila. That's a great question. I think first and foremost, architecture is about humans and humanity, and at the most, its most fundamental, basic, to me, it relates to human beings and their most, basic desires and needs. And in that sense, architecture is totally universal because it serves us as people in our most basic needs and desires. That being said, and I should say, Ludmila, that to me is very important to identify those elements, those passions and desires on every project that I start again and again with my team before we jump into the layers of complexity of locality and the needs of program, local place, cultures, etc. Because if we forget that, we sometimes find ourselves repeating formulas that are more fashionable than substantial. So to me, the idea of connectivity to nature and connectivity to other people is one of the most fundamental elements in every building. The desire for gatherings in different scales, the idea that architecture needs to cross different scales to accommodate our need for intimacy while it requires a need for gathering or being in public. Lastly, I think that our desire, the way we're wired towards beauty and proportion, that is something that humanity carries, I think, as a whole. And then after that, there's always clearly the layers of cultural and locality that impacts the projects. And maybe I will give a few examples, but let me see if I can do that. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So first and foremost, I would say we're lucky enough to work really in an increasing amount of places in the world, and almost none of them has been due to business development or reaching out to clients. I would say all of them has been cities and clients in different places around the world that approached us based on things that they've seen in New York and asked us to compete or to come in and participate, which was, as a part, I think, is something quite incredible because it allows us to be surprised. For example, we are now doing a lot of projects in Moscow, Russia, a place that I would never think in my early career that I would work in. This kind of relationship brought me to Buenos Aires, to Mexico, as well as to places like New Delhi or Seoul, and also within the US, being concentrated in New York and being so many buildings here, it brought us into Seattle and LA and Toronto and other places in the Northeast. And the typologies, I believe, are not necessarily carrying an immense style, although we can talk about stylistic choices and beauty. Rather, they are diverse in both scale and program. But I do think that what unites them is humanity and sort of human desires. I want to share 3 projects in 3 cities. The first one is called Mazdi. It's in Moscow. The Russians in Moscow have decided, and when I say the Russian decide, you know how the Russians make decisions. They've decided through the mayor and the city architect that they're going to create new typologies of mixed-use projects around the 3rd ring of Moscow. And if you see here, and I'll try to mark it up, see if I can. This is the city of Moscow, where the only place where they have high rises, and this is what's called the 3rd ring, which is an area that is sort of developing. Used to be mostly industrial area. They wanted to build sort of a new neighborhood that is a mixed use, that has different components. And we came in and we said, well, if you look at the typical Russian typologies, they're either building a very long bar buildings, or they're building now these kind of towers in a park, which is a formula we know for many years have not been super successful. What if we look at this as a much denser grid of towers that shares very intimate courtyards, and then sort of create substruction from that tapestry to create different scales of public gatherings. And again, the idea started from the ground up. So we have a park, we have a cultural center, we have residential buildings, we have some hotel program, and then on the other side, we have an office complex, also have some retail to it. And the idea was to connect these 2 sides through a ring of landscape, where essentially this area, we added some cultural component, food and beverage, as well as retail. And on the other side, this kind of overreaching arch and this arch are connecting the 2 sides together, allowing for a city center, if you will, at the core. We also brought ideas to them that they were not so used to. For example, using the roof area to have these restaurants that are connected through the roof, and then the city center, which later on have developed into a multi-function. That you see a museum here, galleries at the ground floor, food and beverage, etc. And this is a view to kind of the city of Moscow, the office complex and the resi. Now, clearly the understanding, and before I move on to this, hold on, it's running too fast. The understanding of the sort of the culture that's going on in Russia, as well as the weather, and has led us to many decisions that has to do with the public realm. The access to indoor-outdoor is something that was challenged by the city. The usage of roof and green roof is something that they said cannot be used. But all in all, and the scale of the gestures being in such kind of large capacity next to the very masculine systems of roads, while at the same time creating a very intimate type of interactions. All of these came together to build that project. In Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, we won an international competition. They had this building right here, which is the old post office building. It's right next to the City Hall and the World Trade Center. 3 of these buildings are the only structures that were left after World War II, where the Germans have kind of bombed the rest of the city. So they're national monuments, they're very important. But as you know, the post office is not does not have the same needs that we have today. And they thought, what can we do with this? They had a zoning to add a tower, but there was a huge national resistance to the idea of touching the old monument with a tower. We recognize that this is an old building with an amazing history. It almost became like the back room for Rotterdam in a connection with the world, because the telegraph and the post office was the place where everybody went to send letters and to get letters. And in a way, think about this. This was the iPhone, architectural iPhone of the the 19th century, and it was celebrated. And think about it as a beehive. And we looked at the history, and they literally had thousands of people coming in and out from this historical building, enjoying this amazing sort of cathedral space and meeting with their neighbors, etc. And I came back with that notion that the city deserves a new type of meeting space that relies on the history of their grandmothers and grandfathers. And we came up with a plan that combines a new tower over the sort of historical building. But the entire idea was to take the main street, which is Coolsingale, and instead of using the hall as a dead end in and out center, cut through the building into the service area, create a tower that is bridged over a mega structure, maintaining this as a public space and connecting back to Rotterdam, where OMA have designed a building that is Resi plus the Museum of Rotterdam. That street almost nobody knows about. And we made an urban argument that relates to the idea of gathering in different scales, where people from the city would use the building as a passageway from the museum all the way to Coolsingale. And these two rooms will become sort of gathering spaces of Rotterdam that is similar to its historical use rather, but use new programs. There's an event space, there's a 5-star hotel, Kimpton Hotel, there's a residential tower, there's an office component, and there's retail. And all of them kind of come together as a mixed-use projects anchored by the two formed courtyard. One of them is the historical one. The other one is kind of the newly formed, what used to be a service courtyard now become an internal connecting courtyard. Now, again, this is a very touchy project for the people of Netherlands. There was a lot of resistance in the beginning to the idea, but step by step, we've been able to convince them that we understand the history, we understand the qualities of the historical building, the rhythm by which it's built, the inspiration, the hierarchy, and we started weaving through these elements a new narrative of a modern building that sits next to the historical building, sits next to the city hall, but at the same time opens up a door to something totally new. The tower is a very unique one. It's a double-layered, basically double facade, limestone building. Every apartment has its own built-in terrace, a furnishable built-in terrace. It's also extremely sustainable. It collects rainwater, it irrigates itself. It breaks the wind as it goes down into the main street through the fenestrations. It brings light into apartment in different capacity, as you see in the studies here, based on the depth of the facade. Oops. You still see me? And it also relates to the monuments that kind of tailored Rotterdam today, which is the MVRDV Market Hall, the most kind of contemporary expression of gathering spaces, into the most historical church in the city center, both architecturally, with cues from each one of them, and in terms of its narrative, bringing people to city center. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I thought I lost you for a second.
That's perfect.
Okay. I want to go really quickly through the interiors. We are doing all of the interiors for the building, working with the Landmark Preservation Commission. Everything in this building is landmark, and we have to work in our interior design to enhance the narrative, to tell the story of post office, which we thought has to do with ink. It has to do with sort of typology and writing the message. It has to do with tectonics of kind of stamping, and a lot of these themes are kind of coming in through the sort of the post. You know, that when you peel off the post, you've got this kind of weavy edges into the man-made kind of features that we include in the rooms, into the idea of ink, in the formality of both the lights and the mirrors, etc. So it's just, again, it's a building and complex that touches the most fundamental elements of humanity in cities today, but it's very much tailored to the poetic story and narrative of this building and in Netherlands in general. And the last example is in Mexico. I just wanted to show something closer to you. Plaza Condesa is an historical neighborhood. I'm sure you guys know it, in Mexico City, in a small scale, actually. It's sitting right by one of the sort of the central parks. And it has a building right here that was built in the 60s. It's way overbuilt to its context. It has a performance auditorium here and some offices, but the building, because of the great earthquake, has become unstable. The developer who owned it wanted to replace it with a building that has the same volume, but carries a different program. And it's a challenge because how do you bring a building like that to a neighborhood that is much smaller in context? Our idea was, again, has to do with the public realm. I noticed that in Condesa, although the streets full of trees are full of life and restaurants, etc., there's no big gathering space like an urban plaza. It's more linear experience. And the park, which is gorgeous, is kind of disconnected through a main street right here. We're inspired by the idea of markets in Mexico City, which has sort of this tactile, almost kind of temporary feel to them, while they're very much prominent and huge in scale. And so we've basically came up with a ring scheme that would bring people under the canopy of the building into a public plaza at the center of this kind of fully created courtyard, and essentially would open up the connection through this public plaza into a -1 kind of auditorium and a food hall, and surround it with double-sided program, which is both art galleries and retail, and then built up on that a step building that has a big gap in the middle, and that gap brings light into this courtyard, sort of activate the upper parts of it, brings the idea of landscape from the street up into a higher level, and then combines both hotel and resi. This is the hotel portion and the residential on top. And again, I think that for me, the idea of taking a public park, bringing people into a unique type of urban experience that perhaps is complementary to what exists, but different. And then we try to look at local materials. This is a local Mexican stone, and bring it into a sort of a contemporary way back into a building that, while is very open, is also kind of massive and intimate through the gardens.
Okay. Eran?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yes, Rodrigo is asking that those projects are competitions or just work.
The Russian project, the Moscow project, was a competition, international competition, invited 5 architects from around the world that we won. That brought to a series of other projects in Moscow. The Rotterdam project was an international competition. Again, 5 offices from around the world. And the Mexican project was just a straight commission.
Okay, so commission and competition by invitation, by a reduced
By invitation.
group of. Okay. What about context in New York with your typical setbacks, and is there a relationship about your work and Jerusalem? I think that yes, but what do you think?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Pablo? Is the connection
What
between
is
the work and
what is
work?
the origin of the setback in New York? What's the relationship in these small blocks with New York and with your youth in Israel?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I do think that as architects, we carry, as people, as humans, definitely creators, we carry our trajectory through our history and our upbringing. I have to tell you that I grew up in a small town in Israel. It's called Beersheba, and essentially it was built in the 50s in as an idea of series of courtyards. So it was 3 bar buildings, about 6 stories tall, around a courtyard on the road, and there was a lot of them. And our life as kids were really in that courtyard. Can you hold on 1 second? Ask Kelly that the other projects that I want to show are not here. So I think she needs to.
Kelly what?
Okay.
Can you just say something?
Yes. Okay, 1 second, guys.
All right. See ya.
So I'm sorry, the Courtyard Story. And my parents were divorced. I grew up with my mom. And I would come back from school around 2 o'clock and play outside in the courtyards. And my mom would come around 4. She used to work at a hospital. And she would make dinner, and then she would call me from the balcony. But she didn't really call me. She used to whistle to me. There was a whistle. Now it sounds funny, but every mother in our neighborhood and every family had a whistle. And so between 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we had this symphony of whistles in the courtyard that everyone knew that, the day's over, we have to go to eat. And for us, it was normal. It was like a ringtone, an Asian ringtone on the phone. But that idea of the whistling moms in the courtyard have kept with me for many years. And it's one of the sweetest memories that I have of my childhood. There's something architecturally super poetic about it. The courtyard was big enough for us to feel wide and to play and to have all diversities of people from the neighborhood, old and young. But it was small enough for mothers to whistle and for us to hear that. And that connection between scalability, humanity, and the story of people and how they kind of tend to interact is something that I always was intrigued by. And clearly coming from that background into the city of concrete in New York, I felt that what happens with modern cities, as they grow vertically and as density increases, is that they're losing the most poetic moments of urban architecture that I grew up on, and many of us did. There's a missing link in the scalability between the street that has become overly crowded and this whole experience of retail on street, which now is dying and shifting, which we need to talk about also. We used to play in the street. Now, kids are not playing in the streets. And then these mega towers by which people live in small units, almost lonely. That kind of distorted human experience of urbanism between being lonely in your apartment or being with millions in the street it's something that I'm trying to bring back. And somehow the narrative of in-between spaces, the narrative of expanding the public realm, the narrative of collectiveness in different scales is something that I think every city in the world is now kind of struggling with. Density and quality of life. How do we bring more people to live in cities together? How do we maintain quality of life? And to that end, I guess what was very emotional and intuitive to me from my upbringing had become an international theme in my work, throughout the world.
Okay. Are you Flora? Do you want to ask something to
All I have is
Aaron
this.
about?
I don't have any.
Or we can wait just a moment. Are you going to show something to us or go?
I wanted to
another
show a
question?
few things, but Flora, I'd be happy to hear your
No,
question.
we can wait. We can wait. We will, if you can show the people some New York projects with this.
That's okay.
setback. Okay. If not, Flora, I can see. No la veo. No sé dónde está.
Okay.
Otra
I got it.
pantalla. Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry, Flora, go ahead.
Hello.
Flora, be free. Be Flora.
Exactly.
Yeah. Please, I would like to know, what do you think about, maybe it's a problem of our cities, not of the problem of the work you have shown, but in our cities, sometimes the local legislations of the city define architecture. You have a certain volume, area, land, uses, and you have not much more movement for the ideas. I think that in that occasion, regulations are praying for architecture. But that happens in the work you are doing. What do you think about that?
So, Flora, I want to make sure that I understand the question. You said that with the limitations of city regulations, there's not much ability to create movement within the building.
Yes, they are very strict, and you can move. You must move inside the volume, at a certain volume.
I'll show you something. It's a great question because that's, I think, something we all struggle with to some degree. And let me see that I have. I'm going to stop this. Can you see the screen again? You see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes,
Perfect.
So I started a while ago creating those digital models that we do for every project that are the study that we call the breathing room of every building. And what they're meant to do is not necessarily finalize a design idea, but rather investigate what the envelope is based on the regulation and how much can the building grow or not within those limitations. And sometimes there's more than others, but I know that a lot of people recognize our firm based on this typology of building. So I just want to say something. If you look carefully, very carefully at the zoning regulations of every city, but New York City is included, there are rules and then there are exceptions to the rules. A lot of architects knows the rules, but they never study the exceptions. And part of it is because it's just 2,000 pages of rules that nobody wants to read. But the exceptions to the rules are the tool by which we can kind of find flexibility. In New York, you have to maintain a street wall, for example, but then there's places by which you can recess They have to be a maximum of 30% recess. You need to have a setback, but sometimes you can have a dormer, which is, it's bringing back the setback. There's maybe hundreds of different rules. We try to exploit all of these rules and understand to what degree they allow us to create flexibility within the massing. And in order to do that, you really need to be an expert in zoning. And I keep on saying to my friend architects, sometimes we hate to be lawyers, but if we work in cities, we have to understand the rules in order to be able to break them. And almost every building that we're doing is following these kind of ideas of breaking away from the big rule. This is a project that we're doing, we've done in DC, right on the waterfront. It's a mixed use of hotel and residential. The basic zoning regulation required us to do a U-shaped building, as you see here. Not much great. And we knew that if we set back, we're going to lose area, which the developer didn't want. But we did find that right here, there's a proposed park. And in the rules of the park, we found a place by which there's no limitation of how much we can cantilever over the park. And so we've decided then to switch. The hotel would then cantilever over the park, create this amazing urban experience where the residents are going to set back and create those private terraces. While doing that, the hotel will get the open views, the resi will get the terraces. And that's how we got this kind of through the zoning committee in DC. And you see, this is just a big description of this building. This is a shop building. But you see all of the other buildings that are all falling under the same regulations are pretty much the same. They're these boxy buildings. We've just managed to break away on the waterfront, create this unique experience under the canopy of the building here, and maintain the floor area, create more light that comes into this courtyard that is now shared by the hotel and the resi, create this beautiful 3 apartments, each one has this terrace. And then this becomes the language and the architecture that enriches and enlivens the entire project. So if everything else is, without taking anything away from it, is a repeating block, we broke the mold through that. In Renwick in New York, we knew that there's a setback line required, which is basically a New York City typology. And then there's this kind of weird rule that's called the dormer rule that allows you to build this triangle area right here. And a lot of buildings in New York, you see that triangle built here. But when I looked very carefully in the rules, there's nothing that says after you calculate this area, where to put those cubes. And so we came to the city and say, well, here is the triangle, but we're gonna put those cubes wherever we want. Why? Because then we have much more free way to design these homes at the top. We can basically duplicate the amount of outdoor space. And there's nothing in the rules that doesn't allow us to do that. And in fact, we were correct. We call this the flying dormer. And I must be saying that I'm proud that after we got this done and approved in many buildings, this became a new typology in New York. You see many architects are using it. And a lot of buildings that starts to look like this building. But the qualities of architecture that are created are the most important element. So you can have an apartment in New York like this one, where you're sitting on your own terrace, your apartment is on the left, you have your piano room right in front of you, this is your own apartment, and underneath this in the duplex, you've got your own garden. And this feels more like a house than an apartment. The light and air exposures here are amazing. And that's, that was a revelation that we found. And now we're building probably the sort of the tallest fractile tower on 57th Street. 57th Street is a corridor where all the luxurious straight up towers have been built. And we're trying to break the mold. And what we said was, if I can do this straight up tower, can I then break the mass through a sky exposure plane create a neighborhood at the base, recess inside the building here, and then end with a clear typology at the top. And this building is getting into construction right now. I'm actually very excited about this. And again, it's not about the formal expression for me. It's not about the formal expression of the building being sort of fragmented. It's about a different quality of life within city. To be on 57th Street corridor on the Upper East Side and to have this kind of sense of community while maintaining privacy, indoor, outdoor life. This is the whistling mothers in my childhood courtyard to me, translate into modern cities. I hope that was a good answer, Flora, to your question. If I understood it correctly.
Thank you.
Flora, again, or Lucas? Lucas, you want
Yeah,
to
I'm back.
know
I'm
about
sorry, guys.
some-
I'm
Okay.
sorry I missed a few minutes. I have a problem with the internet there, and thank you very much with what everything you've said so far. It's really very, very interesting. And I was wondering whether you find trying to develop alternative solutions, communities, privacy in Buenos Aires is really different in terms of the way you work and operate in regards to the rest of the world, or if there's, I guess, some similarity in the process, or if there's anything which is particular or peculiar that because you said you loved working in Buenos Aires or developing part of your business relationships here. So I was wondering whether that actually is there a difference or something significant that you would like to point out?
Thank you, Lucas. As I said, I love Argentinians, but that's because I came from Israel. I love the combination of human warmth, openness, the same token, the sophistication. I feel when I walk in the street of Buenos Aires that it reminds me of Tel Aviv. I like the scalability. Buenos Aires has its own issues, like every cities, maybe a little more than other cities right now. But I did 2 projects in Buenos Aires, and each one of them I think is super unique to that city. And let me share this, and I'll explain why.
Aaron?
Yeah.
Excuse me, there's a question about if you can show some sketch from the projects here in Buenos Aires. I don't know if you can, but
I think I have it. So one sec.
okay.
I think I have it. So I've been working with Pablo and his team and Assasson team on 2 projects that I think are, to me, really fascinating and unique. Here, the first one is a residential building and the other one is an office building. Each one has its own story, and both of them I think are super unique to Buenos Aires. The first one is Zeta, and Zeta is a residential building right next to the university. In a way, you can say it's a typical residential building. It's a mid-block. The neighborhood is great, but it's limited to a certain facade width, and you know, it carries to the right side. And what I think made me do this, which is consistent with our theory, but I would not be able to do it anywhere else, is the way that we've treated this facade. So the indoor-outdoor relationship in Buenos Aires is absolutely incredible. I can't even imagine an apartment without an outdoor space. And I did find that most of the developed projects are essentially a square building with a linear balconies. Is that correct? That's a fair assumption, no? We've got a lot of linear balconies.
Yeah.
And while the weather is incredible to be able to work, to live in and out, while people love the idea of family and gathering and friends, being outdoor, indoor, people love the idea of barbecuing. I find it very strange that the balconies are so narrow and long, because a narrow balcony, it feels like a corridor more than it feels like a place. And with Pablo and his team, we started looking at this typology, and I was thinking, well, can I take a piece of that linear balcony and turn it this way? And would that be any different? Or can I start having a series of balconies that are not everywhere, but they're in different scale, and they would allow a furnishable room that extends the apartment itself. The other thing that I wanted to do is get away from the flat facade, which is, again, a cookie cutter idea that happens in many cities, Buenos Aires as well, and say, well, can I get corner views, and can I have better interactions with those terraces? And for that, we started working with the envelope of the building, where you can see, if you look carefully, cubes coming in and out in different location beyond the facade itself. So you've got the back facade right here that traditionally would just go all the way through here. And then you have moments by which the apartment is actually reaching out and coming out. And in addition, it interacts with these balconies in different scale and different depths. All of them are kind of supported visually through this idea of a sort of a secondary grid. And I think this is something I could not do in New York, for example, because of zoning regulations. And I think that the shadow that is created is actually beneficial in the sort of climate of Buenos Aires as opposed to New York, for example. And the idea that you can have outdoor space that is open, but maybe has something above it, but 2 or 3 stories up above. So you don't just get stacked balconies everywhere, which I thought was typical, like this building right here. I'm standing, there's always a roof above me, right? But we break away from this and create balconies that have very unique typology of volumes above them. And each one of them is different. Some of them are 2 stories, some of them are 3 stories. But here is the nicest thing. The nicest thing to me is that it's quite simple to build. It's actually less amount of balconies overall, but they're better balconies. They're better type of living. And the whole idea of community of people, Argentinian people in Buenos Aires, is kind of accentuated through this kind of vertical gardens. Again, you know, for regulation reasons, something that I would never do in New York or even not in Europe. And that idea became the architecture of the entire building. So I didn't have to do anything else. The architecture expression of the building is the idea itself. Balconies that are overlapped in different heights and different shapes, creating these kind of life in cubes, almost like private homes that are stacked. These are some images of the amenities and the interiors. Also collaborated with Israel's office and local great architects as well, and then the pool at the back. So, you know, to answer your question on this one, this could easily become a quite typical Buenos Aires building. You'll have floors and you have linear balconies, but it became a totally different animal.
Eran, if I may, excuse me, Pablo, if I am jumping in, if I may add one more thing to your answer and your explanation and your vision on a project like this one. Do you think that a post-pandemic world will change some of the things you are expressing in a building like this one? Or you think that in essence, the architecture and the proposal for a building like this one, for example, or other ones, is essentially going to be very, very similar?
I think it has changed already. I don't believe that the pandemic is the single source that is going to totally change our architecture. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I do feel it accelerates narratives that were in our conscious for a long time. The idea that you can get out from your apartment in a time of a pandemic and be in an environment that is not alone, you're essentially in a community, but you're protected, and you have an outdoor-indoor space experience. That's something that feels sort of felt perfect for pandemic times. And therefore, it has accelerated the need and the desires by developers and clients to ask for type of apartments that has that. But that need existed before, we just were not tapping into it. So in many ways, I see many of my clients are asking now for things that I've been doing for 15 years. And in the beginning, I had to convince people. Now I don't have to convince anyone, or less so. But I don't think it's revolutionary in the way that we as people want to live, regardless of a pandemic. We want to break the kind of the scale of interaction with our neighbors from being only at the apartment or only at the street. We want to have these intermediate vertical landscapes that brings a totally new kind of way of interactions with the world around us. I think yes.
Okay.
I have another project in Buenos Aires, but I'm going to keep it to the end if you don't mind. Be happy to hear another question.
Yeah. There's two questions from university, from someone here in Architectural University, from Derek in the chat. Can you see it? One is about New York, that it's a constant change. Can you see it, the chat, Era?
I'm looking. Where is the chat? I don't see it. Hold on.
New York is a city that is constant change and movement. New architecture appears all the time. How this changing context affects your projects? This is one, and the other one is, how do you think should be relationship between buildings, ground level, and the CTB?
Okay, as for the dynamic change of the city, I don't think buildings are forever, but I do have something interesting that I think about this. The typical formalistic approach to buildings as a form, where the form dictates the volume of a building, and then the program inside the building has to adapt to the form that we've created. And it's not a secret, buildings, let's say by Zaha Hadid, there's a major formalistic gesture, and the gesture is now dictating to some degree the behavior of the building itself. And at the same time, create an amazing monumental kind of gesture in the urban scale. I find that maybe buildings should be what people call design from the inside out, but maybe that the formal gesture of the building is ambivalent or ambiguous to some degree, meaning that our ability as architects to control the absolutely 100% shape that is uncompromised by anything needs to change to something that is much more of an expression of what this building is about. And so if you notice in this example that I gave, the layouts of the apartments in so many ways dictates the overall composition of the building. And so somebody might say, well, how do you know that this design is done? maybe you change this balcony to the right, or maybe you should change this balcony to the left. How do you know that you finished the composition? And I say to that, it doesn't matter, because the typology of the formalistic shape that ends up as a part of the expression of the architecture is dictated to some degree by the flexibility of the program itself. And to that end, I think this idea, even not on a building scale, but also at an urban scale, is much more, to me, aligned with the idea of change. Because the whole expression is about flexibility. I hope that answers the question. The other question was more about urban design, I think. And,
Flexibility, you said? Flexibility?
flexibility in what? In urban?
No, I didn't understand the word. Flexibility. you
Yeah,
said.
flexibility.
Yes.
Listen, the whole topic of buildings that are flexible. What does it mean? Does it mean that we need to create generic building with generic floor plates that can fit anything? I don't think so. But I think that taking an approach of urban design and an approach of architecture in urban cities that is dictated by the idea of its components, as opposed to a huge gesture that is uncompromisable, is the way that I prefer to design buildings, or even urban scale buildings. And maybe after the urban idea has been formed, it doesn't really matter how the building would look. I can share one idea of an urban scale project if you'd like. How are we doing with time, Pablo? We're okay?
Yes, we're okay. Okay, just a moment. But yes, of course.
Okay. When you guys get tired of me, just let me know. Okay, that's I'm going to skip on that, but this is in some way relates to the question before. This is a new building that is been constructed on 14th Street and 6th Avenue. It's a very kind of prominent corner in Chelsea, and it's a high-end condo building. But again, the overreaching form of the composition. Let me see if I have here. Was basically a study about the maximum envelope with the maximum height based on the program, and to what degree I could stretch the program to create better or more interesting or different types of units. In this case, all of the living rooms are double height ceilings. And you see the expression of the facades are basically double height living rooms. And then it's a sort of a matrix of interlocking units in the architecture that starts with a simple volume at the street wall and starts to break away from it as it goes up and dematerialize at the top. And again, the form of this particular one would argue, well, you know, if you were to move this cube to here, nothing would change. So that I would say correct. What's important at the end is that with the context of a corner building in New York City that typically has a base, setback, and another volume, right? We've seen millions of those. Within that form, we've allowed for the sort of level of flexibility to create more quality of life inside. And these type of unique experiences where you can have sort of these protected gardens open up to the double height living rooms. In this case, very high-end condo building. I'm gonna jump into quick urban idea, if I find it. So we've been asked to design 5 city blocks in Queens, New York, by Silverstein is one of the developers, along with Kaufman Studios and another developer. And basically, they have bought 5 city blocks in Queens. The city blocks are now pretty much empty. There's a lot of parking garages and single-loaded factory buildings that has been kind of vacant. And they've submitted a plan to the city 3 years ago that was rejected by both the community and the government and city planning. And just before they decided to break away, they came to us and said, can you come up with something totally different here? And I have to admit that before that, I've never done a master plan at that scale. This is a 5 million square foot or 500,000 square meters. And it's very involved politically. And my goal was to cater to the new idea of a 15-minute city and to the neighborhood as a community at large, where to me, all this community around this is my client. And I convinced the developer to give up all these green areas, which accumulates to 25% of the footprint, private footprint for development. And this 25% goes back into the community as public space, what we call POPs, privately owned public space. They are anchored by a big park at the corner where the developer initially wanted to build a big tower. And they're then interconnected in an independent pedestrian walkway, independent to the otherwise very rigid grid of Queens and New York City in general. And so essentially, before we even went and discussed with the community the towers and the height, we discussed the new urban amenities that they're going to get as part of that ground floor. And we allowed ourselves, with the approval of the developer, to choose the programs at the ground floor, not based on the dollar amount that they would generate, but based on the best activator to a particular location. And so we've chosen a cultural center here, a cinema entrance here, a market, covered marketway for food here, civic plaza here, surrounded by big stores, a pedestrian alleyway with small local businesses, art courtyard here with 3 art facilities and 1 restaurant, and then 2 family-style courtyards. And then, based on that, we've created a whole development that, it's sustainable for many reasons, but most importantly, it engages and breaks away from the typical streets into a series of urban activators that is supported by the indoor program and the outdoor. And my argument to the developer was, if we create a series of activators, this neighborhood is going to be the most attractive place in Queens, and you're going to get your money up here while giving up the money down here. And I think that concept is something that we all need to think about, especially with the decline of retail, traditional retail, is how we can, as architects, urbanists, and developers, start creating sense of places around public space where the ground floor program is not where we get the most amount of dollars, but where we get the most amount of engagement from the neighborhood at large. And then through that, in different scale, creates the fractality that I was talking about, not only in the building itself and how they're designed, but in the urban scale as well. From big civic plaza to covered market spaces, to small alleyways, and all of them would generate economical developments that is local and would allow for flourish of small businesses. And more importantly, it would create a diversified and activated neighborhood that in return would create value for the developers up above. So it's a sort of a win-win situation. The plan was approved by the community board, which everybody was shocked about, and approved by city planning. And it's in the last steps of approval by the commissioners of New York after the new election, and will be the first formatted kind of neighborhood that has things urbanically that traditional neighborhoods in New York don't have, including the alleyways crossing the mid-block, including the courtyards that are not typical in New York City at all, including covered marketplaces, etc. Pablo, back to you.
Ludmila? Hacemos una pregunta más, Ludmila, Flora, y luego abrimos a todos. Tenías otra pregunta, Ludmila, creo, para Eran.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about formal generation processes. In your presentation, I think there are some layers that you have described, like regulations in the cities and some kind of program adapting to the form. But I wanted to know if there's any relationship between the generation of the form and the kind of software or modeling tools you use, and if there's and what's the process of your office in that sense?
I'm a bit of an old-fashioned guy when it comes to technology, not because I don't use it or like it, but because the genesis of all of our projects are still with the trace paper. Right here, see that? But we are using every software that exists right now, and we're doing 3D printings and models, and we're doing smart softwares that trace and create forms in many different ways. The only difference, I feel, not difference, but the way we looked at it is as a tool and not as a purpose. I remember Columbia University, I'm now teaching at Columbia University, but going back 10, 15 years ago, Columbia University was the first one who's started the blobs series of computer-generated forms, and the general idea behind it was, let's input a set of parameters based on whatever. Let's let the computer create forms for us, and let's choose from them as a point of genesis for projects. I mean, I don't subscribe to that philosophy at all, because there's nothing necessarily human about that point of reference, but I do think it's a powerful tool. So what we do is, once the sketch and the trace paper have brought together a sense of principal ideas, and they're very incomplete, that's where we go back to software. We're doing 3D modeling, as I showed you in the slide, of movements of buildings. We're doing 3D printing. We're using Grasshopper to change parameters that we describe in order to formulate the buildings in different ways. And this is fantastic. It's a great tool, but I feel like we're controlling the tool and the tool is not controlling us, if that makes sense. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah. Flora, do you have another one? Florencia?
Yes, I want to ask, it's my turn? Yes. Well, there's a constant and increasingly changes in the way of living, of using the spaces, of work, of housing, or education. And they have generated a mismatch between the material duration of the building and the validity for the user. This architectural structure lasts more than the social structure. And I think that architects never think about that. But we must think it because it's one of the best cares for our planet, no? Not to demolish all the time. How can we work about that? For example, you are making a building now. I think that Hisena, that will not last a long time.
Yeah. I mean, the topic of adaptive reuse, right? The buildings are staying longer than our social structure or the needs or the technology changes much faster than the buildings are. And not only that we can't afford to demo the buildings, we also don't want to because that's the last environmental thing we can ever think about. Adaptive reuse, to me, has become one of the anchoring sort of elements of modern cities. It's the most sustainable thing to do. But beyond the sustainability, if you think of architecture as a narrative, basically that we as architects tell stories. It's amazing to continue a story that somebody else has started. And if we have the ability to create adaptive reuse of old buildings in a way that transforms them and tell our own story of our time while maintaining the old story of the old time, I think we have a better building with a better story. So usually I'm getting super excited about adaptive reuse projects, much more than ground up sometimes, because you have to live with a storyline that was there before and you have to build upon it. And for that, actually, I can show two examples. And one of them, well, maybe two of them are quite radical in the sense of how the city have looked at it. So this is the first one. 10J. 10J is a building in Dumbo. This is the building. Dumbo is a neighborhood. Dumbo stands for Down Under Brooklyn Bridge Underpass. Down Under Manhattan Bridge Underpass. And basically, this is Manhattan Bridge. It was built in order to connect the factories that started to flourish in Brooklyn on the waterfront and clearly became neighborhoods. And a client came to us and he said to me, look, I own this building. It's the ugliest building in Dumbo, but it's at the best position. It's the most northern one, looking at the East River, looking at the city. And the entire neighborhood is landmark. So basically we could not demo the building. I said, what are we gonna do with this? And I had to do some research, and we found that basically the original building was built by Abrekel brothers as a sugar refinery. What they did is they brought cane of sugar from Brazil. They came from the Atlantic through the East River. They downloaded the sugar canes. They refined them as sugar, upload them, and then went up the East River and Hudson River to Chicago, which was the biggest distributor for sugar and coffee. But here's what's so fascinating is that I looked clearly at this historical picture and I saw that the building we own is only this, and this entire half of the building is not there anymore. So essentially, the history is that this factory that used to be this entire thing, at some point in the 1940s, somebody demoed this, and what's left is the facade here that was infilled later. And here is the amazing part about existing buildings, right? That they have a story. They have something happened here that tells a story about the city. So I went to Landmarks, the city Landmarks, and I said to Landmarks, listen, this facade is a later addition that was just brought in when this building was demoed. This actually is the heart, the middle of the factory for sugar refinery. So there's no point of us trying to clean it up and make it nice. It has nothing to do with the narrative of the building originally. How about we build a new facade that express the idea of sugar grain, sugar crystal, and tell the story of what this kind of building used to be. And we came up with this three-dimensional curtain wall building, a facade, which, believe it or not, was inspired by the geometry of sugar crystal as a state of departure, and then through Grasshopper was developed in 3D to an interlocking system, and originally was designed with steel and glass. Later on, the brick was brought in to illustrate the history of the slabs that used to be here and was broken by the demolition of the new building. And it was a very radical approach for landmarks, because never in New York before such a contemporary addition added to such an historical building. The building itself was gorgeous. It had this kind of composition of cast iron and beams and brick, but it was highly sort of dilapidating. And then we renovated on one hand, and we created the curtain wall on the other hand. And it was become sort of a composition of this kind of fragmented, reflective life of the East River and Manhattan as a reflection or a storyboard to a building that was cut in the middle, where all of the other facades were preserved as the best that we could. Literally rebuilt every detail of the brick wall and the old historical windows, the canopies, but then we added the new layer of our new kind of crystal sugar facade into this narrative. And the result of it is that it became the most successful office building in Brooklyn, getting the best fees and the best rental, and also sort of an iconic identification of Dumbo from the East River as you drive the FDR, with some references to the structure of the bridge, with references to the materiality, but with a totally different narrative and storyline. So to me, that's something that I'm very interested in. And the other example is in Buenos Aires. And Paseo Cajena is a project that we also collaborate with Pablo and his team, where there's an existing parking garage, and I'm sure you recognize this. This right now sits and serves, I guess, basically between the Palermo Park and the racetrack of the horses and the stables. And it's quite a sort of an intriguing intersection, because urbanistically, it's funny that the park is not really connected to what happens on the other side. And the 2 points of connections are actually right here at the edge of this parking lot, and right here, right where the restaurants end. And in addition to that, the train track is crossing through this as a natural border, kind of alleviating by more this sort of bifurcation of this area. So it's a very intriguing question. And we've been asked by our client to come up with an idea that would not only translate this or transform this into an office building, but also create a narrative that is iconic for the city. So a few things that I recognized when I walked the building. The first one, I was intrigued that when I walked into this roof, I could actually see the entire racetrack. And I thought to myself, wow, all these people are paying ticket to get into the racetrack. I would just come up here. This is the best view. While you do this and drink beer, you can also see some of the nicest skyline, and you're right above the tree lines of Palermo Park. What an amazing viewpoint. The other thing is that there's something monumental about the length of this project, of this building, but in a way it connects two very key elements. The one entrance to the park from here, which is right now barely served anybody. It leads into nothing. And then the other corner, which is the pedestrian crossway to the other side of that road. I thought, what would happen if we can then connect these 2 points as a loop within the park that would allow pedestrian and bicycles and whatever to kind of continue the experience of the park, not as a dead end. And while they do that, if we can bring the public up here so they can enjoy the view, that would be quite an amazing attraction. And we started thinking of how we can incorporate the existing structure, demo it as little as we can, allow for a ramp that would allow people to come up here and enjoy these views with a restaurant and a bar, and then come back down and connect to the park. I started envisioning this as a travel, as part of just the fun of being in a park, while creating an office building, a Class A office building, unlike any other office building, that is, instead of being endless and deep, with just one facade, has components of light and air that integrate with a new created elevated park of the 21st century. So this is sort of the result of that study. And, clearly we presented this to the mayor of Buenos Aires, who loved this idea and will be very supportive. And with the help of Assason, and Pablo team, hopefully we can build this. But this kind of thinking that flips a typical garage from a typical office building into a fully integrated, urbanly connected park, I think is what's going to make this sort of an iconic building. It's all poured in place concrete. And then you see, you can see how these ramps can kind of ends up in a peak point right here where you have a restaurant and then an event space on the roof with landscaping to another event space and an office garden here with this courtyard that brings natural light and break the deep office floor plate into light and air and on different locations. And again, sort of a win-win situation of a collaboration of a city, a developer, and an architect. And that's also the end of my slides. What do you know?
Thank you.
Okay, so
Thank you very much.
thank you, Oda, and I propose to talk all together. Who wants can do a question? Emilio, for instance, Gustavo, someone?
I would like to say that in the last project you showed us, that Paseo Higiena in Palermo, I believe that is going to be maybe the most important example of architecture as a public infrastructure, So for us, it's going to be a new typology here in the city. And I believe it's going to make a real change in the way we understand architecture and these kind of buildings when they offer something else to the city and to all of us. I would say that is an amazing example of a new kind of buildings that we're going to have here in Buenos Aires. And I would like to say to honor a friend of us, Alejandro, that worked really hard in this building with you, and he passed away last month. So in his memory, I hope this building could get built.
Thank you for saying this, Rodrigo. Alejandro was a close partner of us every step of the way. Amazing guy. And we heard the news a few weeks ago. It was shocking. And I really, really hope what you said right now really makes me feel even more motivated that we can carry this building through the finish line. You know that nothing is easy. Right now, there's some negotiation with the cities about some waterway and other problems. But I'm hoping that this would be carried, and then maybe we can carry his name with in the building or around this. I think that's an amazing idea.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
So,
Also for me and
yes,
for all the Isons and team is this meeting is in the memory of Alejandro Goldenberg,
Yes.
who works a lot with us and he likes Aaron's architecture and this kind of work with together in a team with him.
Pablo, una preguntita más, nada más, con respecto a este último tema. As you know, we've been working with 3 international offices based on New York, BIG and SOM. And in both of these 3 cases, maybe this question goes for Lucas too, Lucas Werting. The buildings, the proposals, has a really deep connection with the public condition. I mean, they are all private developments, office residencies, high-end residencies, but it seems like when a proposal that comes from an office like yours has more chances to challenges those limits between public and private space. Why do you think that happens?
Why do I think it happens?
Yes.
I think that I don't know about SOM and BIG because I haven't seen what you guys are doing together. I would love to see it.
You are invited to see them.
Okay, great. Look, it's a big there's a big question today, because we understand at this point that modern cities have increased the level of segregation between rich and poor, increased the level of segregation between usage, residential neighborhoods, office neighborhoods, manufactured neighborhoods, cultural neighborhoods, and mostly, increase the level of inequality through the privatization of or the control of the private sector over the cities. And something amazing that happens today that became an unbelievable opportunity for all of us as architects is that realization needs to find a way to be expressed in a win-win situation. And what I mean by that is, there are all kinds of rules for affordable housing and affordable this and, or other things. If they don't make sense, they're not going to be sustainable and they're not going to be successful. We need to find win-win situation where a developer who builds a building is not penalized by the idea of giving back, but actually gain from the idea of giving back. In this particular building, the value of this office, I believe, is going to be twice higher than a typical office building standing alone, because it expands the experience of the public realm. This is not a penalty to the developer. That's a win-win for the developer. It doesn't take away from city resources because we're giving privately owned public land, making it public. So the city doesn't lose anything. In fact, the city is a big gain. So if you think about it in the context of our cities and the dynamic of politics, we have an opportunity today to do the right thing where everybody wins, which is to expand and diversify the public realm, to create more open opportunities at the street level, by doing that, to create more activity and more kind of life at our public spaces, and by doing that, increase the desire or the level of desire by which these projects are built on. And that's a very different concept. You know, when I came to New York 20 years ago, the most exciting thing for an investment banker was to live on Park Avenue with a doorman, because then you are segregated, nobody can get in, then you made it, right? You made it, you're in Park Avenue, there's nothing there but fancy buildings, and you have a doorman, and if you live there, you made it.
Yeah.
We live in a generation where young investment bankers want to live in Brooklyn because that's where all the cool shit is. So we have a generational shift in the way that people see and perceive themselves within the community. But we as architects need to find the formulas by which that is a win-win condition. And I think that if we do that, that's going to totally change our cities. And I hope that the other projects as well as this one are doing so. And frankly, in all of the projects, including the Rotterdam one that I showed you, or I just did a video lately, I don't know if you've seen it, about the Flower District. I created a theoretical video about New York Flower District and how it can transform. It's a win-win situation. We're taking an area that is kind of dying. We're taking privately owned area and giving it back to the public, by which case we are opening the blocks into series of courtyards that are open to everyone. By doing that, we're increasing the excitement that it happens on the public realm and increasing the quality and the desire level of the real estate. And I think that's the way of the future.
Well, thank you, Eran.
Rodrigo, if I
Okay.
may,
Yes.
I'm going to be brief. If I may
You
pick
can.
up on your question, and of course, on Eran's feedback, I think people like Eran, or as you mentioned, other groups like Big or Some, can bring, at least I'm going to just try and be short and brief, but from an Argentinian or Buenos Aires perspective, and they can bring this vision and this experience from big cities from all over the world that I think would otherwise be more difficult for us to try and find and try and develop. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but the truth is that what happens in the world usually comes from some cities in the Northern Hemisphere, at least in these types of developments. So in our case, as you know, we're working with Big, but I think we have a similar experience in terms of the essence and the narrative that Eran described. And if I may, I would like to add a kind of a philosophical question, which I don't know if it has an easy answer, but I would like to ask Eran and perhaps challenge a little bit his thinking. And I think I'm also picking up a little bit on what Flora asked a few minutes ago, which is basically the following. If you look at big masterpieces in terms of monuments such as the Colosseum or the pyramids, or other great pieces of work from an architecture point of view, they've been there for a very long time, and they've been in use for a very long time as well. And if you look at European architecture, in many cases, we find it very classical or traditionalist or whatever, and they've been there for, I don't know, maybe 200 years or so, and we still care for them and keep them, and probably, I don't know, they will have a value and appeal and attractiveness for a very long time into the future. So my question is, do you think that the type of modern architecture, innovative architecture that tries to find the interaction with the public spaces, as you've just described, will last 100 or 200 years? Or people right now change so fast, and the way we live in has proven us, at least in the past year and a half, that it may change so fast that we actually don't know, and that the materials that are very strong materials, and it's not easy to blow them away, are going to be there, and perhaps, I mean, life may change so fast that they will not have the use that we are envisioning today.
No, it is a very philosophical question that I'm not sure I can answer, but I can only offer my very modest humble thought about this. I think when we go and walk the Colosseum, when we go in the old streets of Europe and we see these old buildings, when we walk into Notre Dame's church, we're humbled not just by the beauty of the proportions, the materials, and the architecture, but we're also, in a way, are fascinated by the story that these buildings tell you. I remember walking at the Colosseum with my kids maybe 2 years ago, and they're kids. And when you go there, you explain to them, this is where the lions used to come and fight these people. And they're like shocked by this whole story. And I said, well, this is a story of the culture of ancient Rome. That's how people lived. This is what was important to them. People came here to cheer. And that insected this trip with my kids, much more meaning than just seeing that stone building that for them, quite frankly, was not that exciting. So I think what makes architecture memorable is that it captures in the best form, in a physical form, the story of a current society. And if it does, it tells the story of a current society. I believe that in 100 years, people are going to look back at these icons because they symbolize a story of how we lived and what we cared about. So the short answer is I totally believe in that. There's a question about quality of construction materials and others that I'm not going to get into it right now. And is the construction that we built today has the ability physically to maintain itself for a long time? But I would say yes, because we're going to replace and maintain. So I think that good architectural pieces are to be the ones that are not just monumental in their shape, that they're monumental in their ability to tell a story of who we are today. And then in 100 years, my kids could walk into, Kahena, and this would be kind of weird, but they would say, look, back then, there was an issue of equality. There was an issue where people were not equal. They were rich and poor, they're this and that. And this architecture symbolizes the way by which they sort of attended to this dilemma. So I wouldn't shortchange contemporary architecture because it's not made of stone. I think good buildings today are built and they will stay for a long time as the storytellers of who we were. And in that sense, would not be very different than the Colosseum.
Thanks. Loved your answer.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a good moment to put the finish for the meeting. Do you want to say anything else, Aaron?
Perdóname, ¿no querés leer alguna de las preguntas de la gente que escribió por ahí para que no quede colgada?
Ya leí todas, creo, y si no, lea alguno, las puede leer también.
Okay.
¿Quedó alguien que haya escrito alguna pregunta y no le leímos? Perdón.
I wanted to ask something that is related to Lucas' question from before. Is when thinking on Rotterdam's project, until what point should architecture or new architecture respect these historic buildings? When I like not to overshade shade them. It's I think Rotterdam's project powers this post office, but it's difficult.
No, it's Derek, I think it's a very important question. And the answer to this, time would tell. I have my own opinion. I think as somebody who designed this, it was always a conflict. To what degree the building overshadows the monument and vice versa. I've used the following tools, for example, the lightness of the tower, the fatality of it, it feels like it's almost like a sandcastle that might break, while the foundation of the historical building is so monumental. I've used the setback and push it way beyond, so in perspective, they don't necessarily overpower that, but you'll be the judge of it, and everybody will be the judge of it when it's built. And I hope that history would show that I was right. And if not, you know, that's the risk we're taking as architects by putting ourselves out there with an opinion. And not everybody is going to agree with us.
Okay.
Question. I know
Is there-
you're short in time. Okay. In your residence project, you talk about the kind of feeling of community or vertical village. And beside this term being connected to balconies or terrace, could be there any other kind of space that promotes in some way this concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a few projects that did not show, but the whole idea of amenities that I think we have to relook at this idea of amenities. You know, again, when I came to New York 20 years ago, the whole thing was each building has more and more diverse amenities, right? Oh, I have a gym, I have a playground, a kids' playrooms. And some of these buildings were built that in order to get to these amenities, you have to go down to a basement, go in a corridor, there's a room, oh, there's a pool. Then there's another room, oh, there's a billiard table. It left, basically it lost its entire meaning because there were not architecturally places of gathering. They're just boxes that you turn on and off. And I think we need to look into different type of amenity spaces. Amenity spaces are common places for the community of the building. And they have to be designed as such. I believe they should be around the entire building. And the few towers, one in LA and one in Seattle, where there's literally voids within the building and those voids become gardens. I'm sure that there's other ideas of how to do it, but the bottom line is, we need to use in the best fashion, this idea of amenities or communal spaces within building, not as a series of checkboxes of what I have, but rather as a unique type of architecture within the vertical sphere. And I keep on saying, towers are neighborhoods. Some of our buildings, they're 1 million square foot. They're gonna have 2,000 people in them every day. 2,000 people is a traditional neighborhood, regular neighborhood in every major city. So now we're taking this neighborhood, condense them into one vertical tower, but we lose all of the urban amenities that they used to have. So can we start looking at these towers as vertical neighborhoods and have more than just terraces and balconies? Have mutual gardens, have dogwood, maybe have some retail, maybe the barber shop, the kindergarten. And then, I think to a certain degree that it's not the same as horizontal city, but it's definitely a new way of living.
Thank you.
Okay, now time is over. So, Eran, thanks a lot, and thank Ludmila and Flora and Lucas, of course, and all of you. Estamos haciendo íbamos a terminar después de 10 años de Propuesta Decente, el número nos dio una oportunidad para terminar, pero nos pareció que trabajar con esos 3 estudios y poder aproximar a nuestros colegas, amigos, la voz de ellos era relevante y bueno, estamos haciendo este breve ciclo que continúa el mes próximo con Big y luego con SOM. So, Era, it was great. And if you want to say something or just bye-bye.
Just thank you so much. I'm humbled by this invitation. I'm humbled by this group of people and by your question. So thank you, Ludmila and Flora and Lucas and, Rodrigo, and definitely thank you, Pablo. I said I love Argentinians and now I love them even more. I hope that we can do more stuff in Buenos Aires, and I hope that the buildings will be built. And, and I hope that I can see you in person. But thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Eran. Thanks everybody. Gracias a todos.
Thank
Nos
you.
vemos el mes que viene con Big.
Gracias a ustedes.
y continuamos el ciclo. Gracias, Flora. Gracias, Lucas.
Gracias a ustedes.
Gracias.
Thank you, Aaron, very much.
Thank you.
Chao.
Shalom,
Bye.
shalom.
Sofi,
Shalom, shalom.
Martina, es todo de las operadoras. Adiós.